we go. Nope. I thought Monday was going to be mellow. What is happening? Okay. And is my screen showing as like the presenter view or a different way?
It was showing your presenter view, but now it's back to just showing all the slides.
Okay. Hold, please. Right next to the Okay. We're going to try this again. How about now? Okay, good. So welcome. Just a few housekeeping things. So we're going to ask folks to keep themselves muted while we're doing the training. There's going to be time for questions. You can always put questions in the chat. And sometimes staff can answer or the presenters will grab it at the end. We're going to ask folks to use your little raise hand function when it's time for questions. You will be getting all this information via email. So we're going to present, we are going to be recording this, and we are also going to share out the slides and post them on our website. We have recordings and all the slides from all our past trainings. And I'm going to launch a really quick little poll. We just want to see who is in the room. So while we're hanging out, all of these responses are anonymous, so we're not going to share out who said what. But we like to understand who's in the room so we can see how the folks that we're training are matching the population that we're serving. We also want to know, so around race, ethnicity, and also lived experience of homelessness. And then we kind of want to see what kind of agency you work for or what kind of work you're doing. So that just helps us better target all of our trainings and understand who's here. Just a few training norms and agreements. So we're just asking folks, as always, please respect your trainers. Even if you don't necessarily understand or agree with what they're saying, we're going to ask folks to be respectful, and same for other attendees. We're going to ask folks to make space, take space. So if you're a big talker like me, this is a chance to sort of simmer down and try and hold your tongue and leave space for other people. If you tend to be a little quieter, this might be a good opportunity to practice asking questions or stepping forward. Same, share the mic, sort of that same idea. And acknowledging power and privilege. So depending on what the topic is, some of us may come into the room with different kinds of power and privilege. I'm just asking folks to be mindful of that as you're engaging in this training. Just a quick note about our CoC trainings. So these are monthly trainings that we offer for homeless service providers and anybody in our community who's interested. Many of our topics cover things that are either mandated by the federal government or other funders, but also things that we in our community have decided are important. They're generally the second Monday of the month from 10 to noon, and they are required for direct service staff. I won't belabor that. Shelby, anything you want to say here?
Just the usual spiel, what Jamie just said, that the trainings are required monthly. Try to have at least one person from your team attend the training, preferably a case manager or a program manager. And then we'll be talking about them at our quarterly meetings.
Great. And then we always like to highlight, so sometimes it's HUD that's requiring this topic and some that we've decided in our own system of care. For this one, it's not required by HUD, but it's incentivized, which means like they actually want to see that we're doing this, even if they're not mandating it. And a lot of what we're going to talk about today also falls under sort of housing first. We do have a separate training about that we can share with you at another time. And then finally, before we get started, we really want to make sure folks are thinking about equity through all the work that they're doing. And so as we're going through this training, start to think as we're talking about folks that have been involved in the criminal justice system, are there inequities that you think may happen for this population? Are there ways that you've contributed to or interrupted inequities or uneven treatment of folks or people's experiences? And think about what barriers might still exist and how might they be addressed. So these are kind of rhetorical questions for you to just keep in the back of your mind, but want to just frame that as we're getting started. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing. And I'm going to share the results real quickly of the who's in the room. And I'm going to stop sharing with that, and I'm going to turn things over to our trainers.
Great. Thank you so much, Jamie. Good morning, everyone. Nice to see you all. I'm Michelle Burns. I'm with Homebase, and I'm joined today by my colleague, Sarah Ahmed. Just get this PowerPoint up. And we're really excited today to be able to talk to you about meeting the housing needs of people with criminal records. Um, I am going to be kicking us off today. And so why don't we just start with we've already done the Zoom housekeeping. Thank you, Jamie, did all of that. Little bit about who we are. So Homebase, we know many of you on this training, but if you're not familiar with us, we work a lot with H3 and with Contra Costa County to support them around ending homelessness in this community. We're a nonprofit and we do capacity building, training, and technical assistance. Primarily with local government agencies as well as service providers. And Sarah and I are both part of the Criminal Legal System Initiative, or CLSI, which is a project within Homebase that's focused on the intersection between homelessness and the criminal legal system. And so we do similar type of things as the rest of Homebase, but really focused on that intersection. So I wanted to introduce ourselves right now. As I said, I'm Michelle Burns. I'm a directing analyst with Homebase. I do a lot of work within Contra Costa County and including the annual monitoring process and ongoing trainings. I saw some of you at the Council on Homelessness orientation last week, and I'm excited to be here. Excuse me, Sarah, do you want to just introduce yourself?
Yeah, happy to. Thanks, Michelle. Hi, everybody. My name is Sarah Ahmed. I'm a staff attorney at Homebase. Like Michelle said, I'm also somebody who staffs the CLSI initiative within Homebase, and I'm really excited to be here.
Great. Sarah. So in terms of, just wanted to go over a few community guidelines. I know Jamie went over some of them. I encourage you really here to be as present as you would be as if we were all together in one room together. So be as present as you can. We also really encourage you to take care. So the content is heavy at times. It may be activating for some people. And please do what you need to take care of yourself, whether that's taking a break, walking away for a moment, whatever you need to do. We're going to ask that you maintain confidentiality of any sort of personal information that might be shared. Definitely put questions in the chat or raise your hand to speak. We will have some specific times during the presentation where we're going to be inviting your participation. As I said, take breaks as you need them. And then, if you have your camera on, that's great. It's really up to you. That just, we like to know people are engaged, but it does not have to be with your camera on. So it's really whatever feels comfortable to you. This is what we're going to be looking at today. We're going to start with a review of the current policy landscape with a focus on recent efforts to criminalize homelessness. We'll talk about what that means and what it looks like on the ground. We're going to be talking about the local implications of these policies and the practical and legal protections for people with criminal records. Then we're going to be joined by two guests who are going to do a case study and provide opportunities for your questions. So these are our goals for today. We have 4 primary goals for today's training. The first is to understand the intersectional nature of housing, homelessness, race, and the criminal legal system. Secondly, we want to help you to increase your knowledge and understanding of the changing policy landscape, including the grants pass Supreme Court decision from last summer and the governor's executive order also from last summer. So we're kind of doing some updates on that. We want to identify practical and legal limitations for what criminal records can and can't tell you, and then also learn new ways to recognize and minimize housing barriers for people with past convictions. I'm going to pause for a second. Does anyone have any questions about what we're covering today? If so, you can raise your hand or put things in the chat. Also want to say, if you have any sort of technical challenges or things, you're welcome to send a direct chat message to me, Michelle, or to Sarah, or to Jamie Jeanette as well. And we're going to be monitoring that throughout the training. Okay, seeing no questions, I'm going to turn it over to Sarah.
Thanks, Michelle. Okay, so we will get started with talking about criminalization of homelessness. Next slide, please. Alrighty, so what do we mean by the phrase criminalization of homelessness? This usually refers to laws and enforcement actions that punish survival activities of people experiencing homelessness when they have no other option but to sleep outside. This thing really falls under a bigger phenomenon, which is, or a bigger umbrella, which is the criminalization of poverty, which usually refers to laws and enforcement actions that punish people experiencing poverty for survival activities, and then in turn traps them into this cycle of criminal legal involvement where they're not able to pay their fines and fees. Next slide, please. All right. Why do we care about this? We care about this because criminalization causes a lot of harm. The reality is that criminalization of homelessness punishes folks for simply existing and prohibits life-sustaining activities such as sleeping, camping, eating, sitting, and or asking for money, resources in public spaces. Criminalization often leads to sweeps. I'm sure you've heard that phrase before. Sweeps are usually a forced disbanding of homeless individuals and homeless communities from any one designated area. They're often conducted with the threat of force, the threat of arrest, the threat of citations, and or usually are accompanied with the destruction of property to coerce homeless communities to disband. They're really harmful because they fracture communities, they displace folks, they cause a lot of damage to folks' physical and mental health, and they regularly result in the loss of life-preserving shelter and medication and cause a lot of trauma for those who are being removed. They're often accompanied by tickets and citations and even convictions, which can all be additional barriers to a person's housing stability. Often they're conducted by governments that usually have no plan to house or adequately shelter folks that are displaced in these sweeps. And they also siphon away public funds away from effective and more long-term housing solutions. So here's a few examples of the ways sweeps can perpetuate harm. So folks are obviously having their property taken or destroyed. This can include things like medication and mobility aids. This can also include things like really important documents like their IDs or green cards, or anything else that they're kind of required to be able to be stably housed. Constant move orders from law enforcement can also lead to serious sleep deprivation. As we all know, sleep is a basic and necessary human need, and chronic lack of sleep can have serious health ramifications. Constantly having to follow move orders can also mean that folks are moving to unsafe areas that puts them, further at risk of being not only criminalized in those new areas, but also being harmed by the element or their new surroundings. Next slide, please. So criminalization not only impacts a person's physical and mental health, but also it perpetuates this really vicious cycle of homelessness. Lack of stable housing often worsens a person's criminal legal outcomes and makes detention more likely and diversion less likely. So a lot of programs, as we know, may require a permanent address. Lack of stable housing makes it so hard to fulfill any conditions of a sentence that require any kind of address on file. Most of these are premised on having stable housing, and often fines, fees, court costs, and restitutions kind of create a snowballing financial challenge. And then, of course, as we know, having a record just makes it so much harder to secure and maintain housing. So having that criminal record may mean that your eligibility for public housing is impacted, and often it carries a huge stigma when it comes to finding housing through private landlords. Next slide, please. We also know that these consequences can constantly snowball. So it can start with a very low level infraction with no jail time, but can very easily lead to jail time. It can, the risk of rearrest increases when people are detained even for one day, and the risk doubles if that detainment is up to 3 days. When a defendant misses an infraction deadline, court fees are usually added on, the costs double, and if they're unable to pay that, then even a bench warrant can be issued. So something so small can have such serious ramifications for a person. And then once a person is in detention, that can often, force guilty pleas and lead to a criminal record. There's a study that demonstrated that there was folks saw a job loss in like 30% of people who spent 3 days in jail or less. So job loss can mean further destabilization because you're not able to pay your rent, you're not able to pay your bills. And then, of course, the lack of income means that you have no housing. One last statistic that I have on here that kind of always shocks me to my core is that 1 in 10 jail suicides occur within the first month, which is kind of scary when you think about just the kind of mental health ramifications that detention can have on a person. Next slide, please. So giving some national context and examples, we talked about sweeps earlier, but what else can criminalization of homelessness look like? It can look like a lot of different things. It can look like camping bans. It can look like penalties for obstructing traffic or sidewalks, or penalties for sit-lie laws, which usually prohibit sitting or lying on the sidewalk or any other public spaces. It can include laws that penalize people for keeping their things on public property, and it can lead to also the confiscation and destruction of their personal property. It can often look like quality of life laws that prohibit behaviors like loitering or public urination, and it can also look like laws that target service delivery. So I'm based out of Houston, Texas, and here we have anti-food sharing laws where if you're handing out food, you can very easily get ticketed. So all of these things kind of come together to criminalize not only poverty but also especially homelessness. Next slide, please. All right, why do we care about this? We care about this because often criminalization is touted as the solution to homelessness, but it is absolutely not, right? Research has found that criminalization ordinances do not reduce local homelessness. This is because people who are experiencing homelessness are not doing so by choice. And it seems really common sense, but it really has to be said out loud, right? The sweeps are not targeting the root cause of homelessness, and they're only furthering displacement and destabilization, and increasing a person's traumatic encounters with law enforcement. And they're leading, for a lot of loss of possessions, social networks, and any other community supports that they might have established. The only solution here is to really increase access to quality housing, to end homelessness and have the kind of mass impact that we're hoping to see. Homelessness also, having access to housing also ensures that we are ending mass incarceration, and we are promoting racial equity. And studies also show that housing first and permanent supportive housing reduces arrests and jail stays, improves quality of life, and increases access to services and increases housing stability. So it really is a domino effect. And once we kind of start with the right square one, which is stable housing, we really see it impact all the way through to a lot of other things. Next slide, please. And so this is important because we kind of talk about how we are investing our money, right? So criminalization really requires us to look into how we want to spend our money, as criminalization is the most expensive and least effective way to address homelessness. Housing is the most affordable and effective solution long term, and unaffordable housing drives homelessness. So criminalization doesn't really address any of the factors that really cause homelessness. There's this really interesting 2014 analysis in Central Florida that we have linked in the slides that I hope you guys take a look at when you get the slides, that really showed that providing chronically homeless folks with permanent housing and case managers would cost about $21,000 less than in that region than like spending that on law enforcement or other kind of criminal actions against folks that are unhoused. So it is not an insignificant amount of money, and it really kind of highlights that. Next slide, please. All right, so I talked a little fast about a lot of different things, and I wanted to take a pause and hear from you all. I wanted to see how you all are seeing homelessness and criminal legal involvement overlap in your work. Please feel free to either come off mute or put your responses in the chat.
You can either do your virtual hand, or we can try and see you on screen if you have any questions, or you can put them in the chat. I see Nicole has a question.
No question. I was just going to give feedback. You said, how do I see it within my work? A lot of individuals that I work with inside the detention center, very sad to say, they get released. But going back to that fact of if they don't meet their requirements or if they don't pay their fines, I end up seeing them return because they end up transient, and part of their release requirements is that they must have an address. They don't have one, so it's like a vicious cycle. So I constantly see individuals that you're hoping that you can connect to some type of housing, but unfortunately, it's just like a repeat effect. They constantly come back in and out and in and out. So I'm constantly seeing that within my work.
Yeah, that's so real. Thank you so much for sharing that. I'm seeing some responses in the chat. Folks are saying that it definitely causes problems with finding housing. It raises up additional barriers. And then clients might be less likely to reach out for support due to fear and mistrust. That's fair, yeah. It creates a lot of barriers to work and housing, limits what's accessible. Anybody else? Oh, I'm reading someone say that clients have experienced clients being targeted by the police during outreach. Oops, went away. Particularly when working in harm reduction services. That's so interesting. It's so unfortunate. I think this ties in really well into the point before where like that can really impact the way people trust the systems that are trying to help them, right? Because if outreach services also means that they're getting targeted by law enforcement, they would be like less likely to want to engage in those services, which is really an unfortunate impact.
I'm also seeing a number of people kind of liking, thumbs upping other comments. So there's obviously some people are seeing similar things in their work.
For sure. I think the last comment kind of succinctly wraps it all up. Some laws are just gross. Yeah, I can't disagree there. Oh, okay. Roll show up and pull a client out of an intake. Did you check him out? Yeah, that's really unfortunate. Well, I really appreciate y'all sharing the kind of things you see in the work that you do, because it's important to hear about that, and it's important to see how it's impacting the things that you're trying to resolve. Yeah, we need to think about how we're investing more into addressing the root causes. Thank you so much. These are all really great. I am going to move on, but keep them coming in because we are reading them for sure, and love hearing about your experiences and what you're seeing. Okay. So I think your responses are a really great segue into my next point, which is that criminalization really worsens the revolving door between incarceration and homelessness. So, I'm sure y'all know this, but formerly incarcerated community members are nearly 10 times more likely to experience homelessness than the general population. And then folks who have experienced incarceration more than once are 13 times more likely to experience homelessness than the general population. So those are pretty, to me at least, a very staggering stats. And then people experiencing homelessness are 11 times more likely to be arrested than the general population, just because they're more likely to have those law enforcement interactions. And I think so much of your experience and the work you do really speaks to how these stats impact the work that you do. Next slide, please. All right. All of that kind of brings us to a discussion of Grants Pass, which is a Supreme Court case that came out in June of last year. It was a pretty landmark case because it kind of shifts the rhetoric and kind of shifts the landscape a little bit around how we understand criminalization of homelessness. Next slide, please. All right, so on June 28th, the Supreme Court issued the Grants Pass decision, which essentially said that camping bans on public lands do not constitute cruel and unusual punishment. And this decision effectively overturned a previous Supreme Court case, which is Martin v. Boise. This decision essentially meant that localities are allowed to impose criminal penalties for acts like public camping and public sleeping without being found in violation of the Eighth Amendment, even if these localities lack sufficient available shelter to accommodate unhoused folks in their communities. So it is definitely a shift from what we've known before under Martin v. Boise, which said that, you cannot You cannot be criminalizing camping behaviors if you do not have some kind of adequate alternative response for folks to utilize, but this overturns that. Next slide, please. And kind of a quick summary of why that is in the decisions, the Supreme Court found that the Eighth Amendment, which is the cruel and unusual amendment that I referred to earlier, it's mostly about curtailing the method of punishment and doesn't really speak to what should and should not be criminalized. And so if that's what we're talking about, then we're talking about how we're punishing someone being outside and how we're punishing camping, and not whether camping should be punished or not, if that makes sense. And so if that's kind of the discussion, then the Supreme Court found that the punishment, which is usually fines or, in some cases, jail time, that is not a cruel and unusual punishment because that is a common punishment scheme that we see enforced for a lot of other things. And the court also emphasized that grants pass is not criminalizing status. It is not trying to criminalize someone who is unhoused. They're pretty much ruling if you can outlaw certain acts. And so that would mean that it applies to anyone outside equally. But we know that the reality of this is that it disproportionately impacts folks that are unhoused. Next slide, please. All right. And so we talked about grants pass, and the next kind of big thing that's worth mentioning is the California executive order. Next slide, please. So this came out just a month after the grants pass decision. The governor of California issued executive order N-124. This is an order that states that state departments, so departments that are affiliated with the state of California, and agencies subject to the governor's authority shall adopt policies consistent with the California Department of Transportation's encampment policy. The Department of Transportation here is also known as Caltrans. And this kind of only applies on state-owned land, right? And the gist of that Caltrans policy is that all encampments should be prioritized for removal. And the way you do it is you do a site assessment to first determine whether an encampment is a level 1 or a level 2. If an encampment is found to be a priority level 1, then it means that it requires urgent, immediate removal because there is some kind of exigent circumstance that poses a safety risk to the folks that are either living in that encampment or to the general public. And there really has to be some kind of exigent circumstance that really elevates it to that level of urgency. And then everything else that does not have that circumstance is just a level 2 and it still needs to be cleared out, but there's not the same level of urgency as a level 1 encampment. And then the rules around how you kind of go around notice and getting folks notified is a little different there. And so state agencies and departments are requested to adopt similar policies. Local governments are encouraged to adopt similar policies. And I just wanted to highlight that encouraged is, it's very weak language in the legal world. So I guess the kind of takeaway here is that this is not really a mandate. It is a nice to have, so to speak. Next slide, please. Yeah, and so CalICH, which is the California Interagency Council on Homelessness, has issued some guidance coming out of this executive order and then grants pass, which they have included in the one-pager that is screenshotted here, and we can definitely get that sent out too when we're sending out materials. The gist of which is pretty much that they will continue to provide funding and guidance for programs that are serving people that are experiencing homelessness, and they continue to highlight that housing first still is required under California law and encourage incorporation of person-centered, trauma-informed, and evidence-based approaches to address homelessness. And finally, they also told us that there are more ERF grants forthcoming, and I think there is also a webinar out there that kind of gets into what exactly this guidance is asking of communities and what it is not asking, more importantly. So that is all linked in there, and we can make sure to get that sent out to you all as we're sending out materials as well. Next slide, please. Okay, so getting into some discussion. We were trying to just kind of get a sense of what the local impact of what we just talked about is on the communities that you serve. So what impacts are you seeing in your community after grants pass and the executive order, and what are any actions or steps that are being taken to continue supporting folks that are unhoused in your community? Would love to hear from you all again. Feel free to unmute yourselves or pop it in the chat. And thank you, Michelle, for putting that CalICH document in.
Hey, Sarah, my name is Angelo. And the one thing that I'm seeing, I currently work as a case manager. My background has been through outreach and case management. I've worked in Las Vegas, walking the Las Vegas Strip underneath the tunnels underneath there to bring folks out. And the one thing that I'm seeing is I'm seeing a lot of programs that are for those who have been incarcerated for a short while and to help them get back on their feet. But I'm not seeing that many programs for folks who are just plain homeless. There is more housing and programs and grants and funding for those who have been incarcerated, guilty of misdemeanors, than there is. I can find a home for them quicker than I can those who are homeless because of a difficult situation or loss of job or rent increase. And it would be really nice to see more of that in 2025. And if there are programs that are there, that there are housing for them now, I would really love to know.
Yeah, thank you so much for bringing that to our attention. Anybody feel like there are programs that they would like to share or respond to what Angela mentioned? Is anybody else seeing something similar?
This
Out of
is
curiosity,
Nicole.
yes.
This is Nicole. I really like what Angelo said because it's a different perspective of my world. I've been working with the justice involved population for many years, and from our perspective, what we see is the opposite. And what I mean by that is there are programs for individuals that are justice involved, depending if they're still on paperwork. But the lack of housing that we see on our end are for those that have completed their probationary or parole. And they are still hit with those same barriers of having that criminal record, and they're homeless, but because they're not tied to any type of probation or parole officer, that's where the lack of the housing support. I do agree with Angela. I always feel like there isn't enough housing, but it isn't that there isn't enough. I don't think there's ever going to be enough. But it's really interesting to see his perspective. Because from my end, for someone that's dealing with this population, I always feel like it's not enough for them to get into the housing. So where there's a group of folks that have been justice involved that don't have access to the programs because they decided to complete their time incarcerated, and when they walk out, they won't be on any type of requirement with probation and parole, so they don't qualify for a lot of the programming that's available.
Understood.
I also wanted to respond to a couple of questions and comments in the chat about what to do if you're conducting an intake. I'm assuming I'm kind of piecing it together, maybe an intake in the field with a client, and then you're approached by law enforcement, or I saw by parole, basically asking to kind of check out the client. And so that would be a situation where one possible approach would be to, I would say, politely but firmly say you're conducting a confidential intake, ask for some space and let them know that as the service provider, you're available to talk to them after this confidential meeting and potentially to be able to partner with them or on a systemic level, but you're not able to talk to them right now about this confidential intake going on.
Thanks, Michelle. I see, Sarah, you have your hand raised. Did you have a response to the questions?
Yeah, just in response to both what Angelo and Nicole said, I find that, so I work in the same county as Nicole and Contra Costa, and I find that in terms of more short-term support, I can see that for there being, like, I'm thinking just about the AOD, alcohol and other drug programs. When someone is leaving inpatient treatment facility, there's the option for 6 months of rent assistance for clients who were released from incarceration. And I believe that's just for clients released on drug-related offenses. 6 months of rental assistance versus like 1 or 2 months for people who don't have criminal record. But I think when it comes to long-term support and long-term barriers, homelessness and low income is a barrier that all of them are facing. And then the additional barrier of having multiple misdemeanors, having felony offenses. I think that's where that support really falls off and where you see how much these people are impacted by the criminal justice system. And then especially for people who are lifetime registrant sex offenders, for housing them.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for saying that. I'm seeing a comment in the chat that's saying that when you can identify the cause of homelessness for an individual, you may be able to identify different types of programs for different situations. So reentry might just be one of them. And there's also specific programs in many communities for behavioral health, substance abuse, domestic violence, etc. That's a great point, Tristan. Thank you for mentioning that. Anybody else before you move on? Have you seen like a particular shift since the last summer, once we've seen grants pass and the executive order come out, in the work you do, in the way that your community is responding to both of these kind of impactful pieces? Okay. Hmm?
I would be, I just saw something from Sarah. Yes, more encampments being swept in our county. That was what I was going to ask is our folks seeing more of a kind of enforcement approach than there was previous to the grants pass decision? Because one of the things that we are hearing in different communities is that, grants pass, as we know, does not mandate that a community conduct encampment sweeps or criminalize homelessness, but it is changing the rhetoric and the overall culture in a lot of places. So wondering if you all are seeing that as well, in terms of the folks that you're working with and how you're supporting them. Okay, well, what we can do is also, if folks have things that they want to share as we continue on, definitely feel free to put them in the chat or raise your hand and we can talk about it more. Okay, Sarah, you all set? Great. Okay, thank you so much. So because we've been talking about the increased focus on criminalization, we're now anticipating that more people who are experiencing homelessness will come into contact with the criminal legal system and have criminal records. So this makes it even more important for service providers to understand what criminal records can and can't tell you, and the legal protections for people with criminal records who are seeking housing. So what we're going to go to next is talk about what we cannot learn by looking at a person's criminal record. So first thing, we cannot learn whether people are dangerous to themselves, other clients, or staff. This is definitely hard. It's very natural and common to want to use a criminal record as a proxy to determine if someone is dangerous. But we do know that criminal records can be inaccurate. And we also know that people of color are more likely to be over-policed and disproportionately incarcerated. We can't tell what the outcome is of someone's case. The reality, again, is that background checks can be incomplete or inaccurate. So we don't actually always know what the outcome is. We can't learn if who a person is today. So it's a snapshot of an interaction with a law enforcement agency, and it may reflect a person's worst moment in their life, worst period in their life. It doesn't tell us whether or not they're going to be a good tenant. It does not also tell us whether they're trustworthy or deserve resources. So we can all think about people who we know without a criminal record, who maybe would not be someone that we consider trustworthy. And then also, I imagine many of us know people with criminal records who have proven over and over again that they are trustworthy and deserving of our high expectations and trust. Secondly, there's no empirical evidence showing that people with records are bad tenants. So according to HUD, there is no empirical evidence to justify a blanket exclusion of people with criminal histories from housing. There's a review that's linked in these slides. It's a review of other studies from 2015 showing that there's no evidence establishing a relationship between a criminal record and an unsuccessful tenancy within the supportive housing context. So people with criminal records can be good tenants and have demonstrated that they can be good tenants regardless of whether they have a criminal record. So there are some benefits to looking at someone's record with their voluntary permission. So you want to make sure that you're doing this in partnership with the participant that you're working with, and have them understand why it would be beneficial to be looking at that. A criminal record can tell us what type of contact a person has had with the criminal legal system. So for example, have they been arrested multiple times for issues related to poverty or being unhoused, just as Sarah was just covering? Criminal records can also tell us which services might help. So for example, if you're seeing a lot of drug possession convictions, you may want to offer voluntary drug treatment. Records can also help us understand the whole person and build rapport. So rap sheets can't tell you the complete story, but they do provide a glimpse of some of the experiences that a person has had. And so responding to that in a trauma-informed and compassionate way can build a lot of trust. And records can also tell you whether a person has been in custody and likely experienced custodial trauma. The experience of being in jail or prison can be extremely traumatizing for many reasons, including that carceral settings are often areas where there is violence and other abusive behaviors. And so understanding whether someone has been incarcerated is helpful in terms of understanding what they may be bringing to their interactions. Okay, so now we know why it can be helpful to understand a person's criminal record, and also to understand the limitations of a criminal record. I want to talk a little bit about some of the legal protections for people with criminal records who are seeking housing. I'm going to start by talking about FEHA. This is the California Fair Employment and Housing Act, and it protects people against housing discrimination based on certain protected characteristics, including race, color, ancestry, and national origin, disability, sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression. And under FEHA, housing providers cannot base housing decisions on criminal history information without having a legitimate justification for doing so. And when we talk about criminal history information, or CHI, we're talking about arrests, convictions, and deferrals. So just having a criminal record is not a legitimate justification for denying someone housing. There needs to be a legitimate justification for doing so that does not violate their fair housing rights. And FEHA is enforced by the California Civil Rights Department. Okay, so let's talk about what FEHA covers. So this law applies to all types of housing providers and related businesses. So this includes landlords, tenant screening companies, property management companies, real estate agents, housing authorities, maintenance staff, hotel and motel management companies. So we're really talking about all housing providers, transitional housing providers, supportive housing providers, sober living facilities. And it applies to people living in all types of housing environments, including single family homes, multifamily housing, apartments, transitional housing, supportive housing, and shelters. So in addition to protecting people of those based on their protected classes, FEHA also states that criminal records can only be considered in specific ways. So housing decisions cannot be based on arrests only. So you cannot look at someone's record, determine that they've been arrested but not convicted, and then deny them housing as a result. Cannot be based on being questioned or detained by law enforcement. It cannot be based on vehicle code violations such as speeding. Sealed, dismissed, or expunged records cannot be considered when making housing decisions, and neither can juvenile court matters. So things that happened within juvenile court when the person was considered a juvenile based on age, that cannot be considered when making housing decisions. They can be considered in certain cases, but they have to be directly related to housing. So it must have a direct and specific negative bearing on the housing provider's substantial, legitimate, and non-discriminatory interest or purpose. So to help determine if a conviction is directly related to housing, we want to consider a few things. What is the nature and severity of the crime? And also how much time has passed since this conduct occurred. So you won't, it's that way, again, it's not just a blanket ban or a blanket consideration. You're really going to want to look at the specifics, as with any sort of services, right? Where you're individualizing it, making it person-centered. You're going to want to be doing the same thing when considering someone's criminal record, and also working with landlords to have them understand that as well. So it's illegal for landlords to advertise blanket statements such as no felons or we do not accept criminals. And landlords who use criminal backgrounds in decision-making should make sure that those align with the FEHA limitations that I just covered. So additional factors. In addition to the factors that I just went over, there's some additional things to keep in mind when considering background check. So if you're a housing provider and you do have background check policies, you want to make sure that they're in writing. You want to make sure that they state what you're looking at and why. Policies should include that the housing provider will give applicants a copy of their criminal history record that was reviewed so they can make sure that everything is accurate and also respond with mitigating information. Landlords should consider all mitigating information they receive, and housing case managers should help clients obtain mitigating information. So these are things to keep in mind both for housing providers and then also for service providers that are working with clients and being the kind of go-between between a property manager, property owner, and the client. So talked a lot about mitigating information. What do we mean by that? So this is information that explains that the applicant is not likely to pose a demonstrable risk to the health and safety of others, the property, or other legitimate and non-discriminatory goal of the housing provider. So in this case, a housing provider, can have a goal that they would like to make sure that people who are living there are safe, but it cannot be based on something not legitimate or discriminatory. So some examples for mitigating information that you can provide is when the criminal record occurred, showing a positive tenancy record since the conviction, showing evidence of receiving a program certificate, letters from law enforcement, letters from teachers. There's all kinds of different things. And so actually I want to ask here from all of you is what kinds of mitigating information have you used to help program participants secure housing? Or if you have not done it directly, what are some things that you would potentially look at to assist one of your program participants in obtaining housing if they do have a criminal record? Again, you can come off mute, you can raise your hand, or you can put it in the chat.
Michelle, I do see some questions in the chat from
Okay,
presenting.
great.
Are you able to see those, or would you rather
All right,
read them?
let me see. Okay, how does this program work with participants with criminal history? Do you use the Clean Slates program? Okay, so that is something we are going to be talking a little bit about the Clean Slate program a little bit later in terms of resources. When you're asking about this program, if you're talking about home base, we do not do direct services. But in general, yes, having record expungement programs where basically you could help a participant to expunge their record so that it shows up without that criminal history is something that we do recommend. And then question about, does it apply for families with juveniles who have records? That would be, it depends. So in that case, if the question is the adult family members do not have a criminal record, but there is a juvenile and their criminal record was just in a juvenile court, then yes, that would be considered, that should not be considered in the housing decision. What are some, again, any sort of mitigating information that you all have collected or used to be able to support program participants in seeking their housing? Great, so see here, I've used reference letters from providers that the client has been working with, such as mental health, professional reference, and rehabilitation programs, and include the certificates received. Great. Yep, that's exactly the kind of thing we're talking about. Sarah, go ahead, Sarah Silva.
Yeah, I don't think that this works in California, but when I did housing work in Oregon, I was able to do reasonable accommodations if we could tie the criminal history to a identified disability. The big difference between Oregon and California, as I understand it, being that substance use disorder is considered an identified disability. But that could also work in cases if someone's got, like schizophrenia or whatever, they can prove that they were not taking their meds when their criminal history occurred and now they are, and get letters from providers. I was able to have some success with getting people's criminal history sort of thrown out in those cases.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, actually, that is an effort that I think a lot of folks are starting to look at now with this increased focus on criminalization, is on reasonable accommodations. And for example, if people are during encampment sweeps, there are situations where people with disabilities are not having, can request reasonable accommodations. And then if they're not being met, there can be legal action taken. Right. Anyone else? Okay, so if a program participant believes that a landlord or other housing provider has violated FEHA, you can help them report violations to the State of California Civil Rights Department, which I said earlier is responsible for enforcing FEHA. So this is the website, and we can also put that into the chat. But again, they can file a complaint directly, and you can support program participants in doing that as well. Put that into the chat. So in this next section, what I want to talk about is going to be having a case study that focuses on supporting the housing needs of people with criminal records. Really excited about this. And during the case study, you'll be hearing about 3 primary strategies to minimize housing barriers. These are reviewing the participant's criminal record, referring them to legal services for clearing their record, and then also developing a targeted plan to address barriers. And after the case study, we're going to have a summary of strategies for minimizing barriers to housing. But as we're going into it, I really encourage you to be thinking about what you're hearing and identify ways that the facilitators are identifying challenges and also doing problem solving during the case study. So really excited about this next part. We're joined today by Nicole Green and Yolanda Hughes. And Nicole is the Reentry Transition Specialist for Game Plan for Success through the Contra Costa County Office of Education. She also holds the reentry seat on the Council on Homelessness, which is the CoC board, and is chair of the Community Advisory Board, or CAB, for AB 109 funding. And Yolanda Hughes is the program supervisor for Lao Family Community Development for HSR and AB 109 Reentry. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Nicole and Yolanda for the case study.
Thank you so much for that. Good morning or afternoon, everybody. I'm excited to be here. We're first going to dive in and kind of go over the case study. Again, I am Nicole Green. I work with the COE, Contra Costa Office of Education Game Plan for Success. Within a detention center, I do a lot of pre and post release services. And then we have Yolanda, I can't see her on here, from Laos. So to set this up, can you hear me?
That's better. That's
That's
better,
better?
Nicole.
Okay, thank you. So the case study, we can go to the next slide, please. So to kind of set the scene, again, I do pre and post release, so I'm working with Yolanda to help a client of mine get connected to housing. So the client name is Mr. Williams. He's age 25. He is recently or about to be released from county jail and is experiencing homelessness. He is on permanent disability due to a brain tumor and has SSI and has limited income. He is considered a transition age youth. He is misusing prescription drugs and has a high behavioral health care needs, including a mental health and substance use disorder. He has also limited family support. He has CalWorks and an enhanced care management. He has Medi-Cal benefits. He has his ID, his social card, and he needs housing, transportation to and from his chemotherapy appointments, and he needs extensive support and services. Some additional relevant information. He has a very lengthy youth and adult criminal record, and he is currently on probation, and he has open cases in 2 different counties with a felony record. Next slide. So we're going to go into some guided questions. I'm trying to see if I can see Rolanda on here, but I can't. I know she's here, but I just see me. So we're going to go into some guided questions and kind of go back and forth with each other in reference to how we can support Mr. Williams. So as Michelle said, keep some of these questions in mind for later. So I'm going to speak on it from behalf of me referring to Yolanda in reference to information that I can collect and provide to her, and as well as allow her to share some of that information. So Yolanda, are you ready to do a little role play real quick?
Oh, sure. I'm ready. I'm sorry you can't see me, but I
I can
am
see you
here.
now.
Okay, okay, great. I'm Yolanda. I work at Lao Family Community Development. We are located in the San Pablo office. And I'm also a CAB member as well. And I'm glad to be here. So let's start this off, Nicole. I'm
All
ready
right,
when you are.
let's do a little role play. Good morning, Miss Yolanda. How are you this morning?
I'm great. I'm great.
Thank you so much for checking in with me and doing this case conference. I wanted to follow up with you in reference to my email to assist my participant, Mr. Williams, and wanted to find out what type of housing you can help provide from him for him.
Well, Nicole, that's a great question, and I'm glad you asked it. We can provide transitional housing to permanent housing for Mr. Williams. First, we have to dig a little deeper just so we can see what his services and his needs are and what barriers he has that we can start by eliminating little by little.
Well, I'll definitely tell you I have a really complex situation here. He's very young. He's transitional age youth. Um, he is going to have SSI as he come out, but he's dealing with severe mental and behavioral health issues with a lot of lack of family support, and he's dealing with a permanent disability. and he's going to be on probation. He also has some felonies in 2 other counties, so there could be a possibility that those would come to play. But once he walks out of detention center, he will not have any support at all, and he'll also need support back and forth from his treatments to the hospital as well. So I need to find a home that is suitable for him, that can assist him around these barriers, also making sure that he can get back and forth, can provide some support around the mental health and the addiction aspect of it. So I have a real cookie here that I'm hoping that your program can place. And he's on felony probation, so I'm not sure if you're able to help me or not, but I'm hoping that you can provide some kind of support.
Yes, I definitely can. And I understand your concerns with Mr. Williams based on a lot of the history that we will be dealing with. First, I'd like to find out more about Mr. Williams' reentry intake. And then to do that, I would collaborate with probation because we get referrals from probation. And once we get that, we also collaborate with the healthcare, collaborate with other reentry programs. Probation can provide this intimate details on the individual's restrictions. So we want to take that also to account. Um, we talked about specifically how can we determine that he's on probation, his supervision requirements, and his living restriction. Well, along with collaborating with probation, we can also bring him in for an intake and start some self-reporting that he would like to divulge and what's going on in his life. I thank you for all those barriers that you listed. And once we bring him in and he starts some self-reporting, we start conducting the intake. I get the referral, which has a little bit more information about Mr. Williams. I would also be able to work with partners in the reentry areas here. We have great reentry partners that I work with on a daily basis. If the client is working with reentry partners, create a pathway to share information around shared clients. Reentry partners have access to client information and changes, so this also helps in this situation. I also like to work with the health partners and gather clients' information, of course, through making sure I have ROIs, and HIPAA is also there to make sure it's confidential. It's the utmost, especially with working with healthcare. We also work with AOD services in that mental health component. And I would collaborate with all these entities to make a greater outcome to start eliminating some of his barriers. And sometimes it may not be eliminating all of them, but we sure start with the number ones first.
Awesome. So we'll pause there. We can go back to the questions, Michelle. Thank you. And
You're
see.
welcome.
All right, let me go back and share that 1 second. It disappeared on mine, so just give me a moment.
No problem. And she also put them in the chat and while she's pulling that up. So I wanted, me and Yolanda wanted to like a little case study first to kind of let you guys hear how we would interact on a referral. And then we have some feedback to give in reference to these questions. So Yolanda did cover some of those. So how can you find out about Mr. Williams' reentry status and the intake? So I'm going to cover a couple and then she'll take some. So collaborating with probation, healthcare and reentry programs. Depending on where you work, for example, I do pre and post, so I work inside the detention center, so I've had some access to information before they get out. A lot of you I'm familiar with also do the work on the outside, so some of you do work with probation, but if not, if your program is not currently working with probation, creating a partnership or a contact or starting a conversation with them will be great because you'll be able to gather information about that particular client in reference to their housing restraints, what they can and cannot do. Believe it or not, what area they can return to. Sometimes clients will tell you that I want to go back to this county, and in reality, they can't. So really, it goes back to earlier when we were saying creating that safe space. We try to do that a lot, especially with probation, so that the client can feel safe in a sense. Healthcare and reentry programs. With healthcare, there's a lot of work being done within the county last year. I know we have CalAIM and all these great things that are rolling out. I can definitely tell you from an in-custody standpoint, there is a lot of work being done inside. And if the client signs the proper RIs and documentation, sometimes you can get the proper information for that client. For example, Mr. Williams, I had a client that was similar like that, and I was able to, with a signed RI, gather all of his healthcare information to provide to all of the reentry providers on the outside. So it wasn't more of a self-report. He reported what he want. Everyone clearly, and with him signing it and okaying it, understood what his health needs were. Self-report, as Rolanda said, we definitely want to create that bonded relationship with our clients to hopefully have them self-report. But sad to say, sometimes you got to take that as a grain of salt, right? So you want to try to be able to validate the information that they're giving you. I'll let Rolanda take the other two bullets if she has them. You're on mute.
Thank you, Nicole. That was great information. The other two bullets would be working with reentry partners. I have to say, working with these partners in the area makes a big difference because sometimes they divulge information, the client may divulge information to other people and not divulge it to me just at that point in time because of the hat or because of the position that we're in. And sometimes once you establish a rapport, you can break down some things and they can start that self-reporting with a little bit more ease. And Mr. Emails Williams' situation and other people's situation, they might be at ease to talk to a male case manager. May be at ease to go through cohorts, and once they go through cohorts, they're able to be in a group setting, and then they might divulge some things with them. So it's really just collaborating with that partnership in the area. And if we have to go on the outside, that's what we do as well. We also work with the healthcare partners, gather the client's healthcare records and collaborate and better support the healthcare for housing goals. In this situation, like I talked about earlier, making sure that the ROIs are in place, making sure that his information is the utmost taken with confidentiality. When we do warm handoffs or talk to other partners, don't divulge anything that he wouldn't have divulged, or if the ROI is not clear with the other partners also. So I make sure all those things are intact. When in this case study, I too had the opportunity to work with someone like Emil Williams that we discussed here. And the first thing that I saw was a barrier with his health care, so we had to work around that and making sure that he is receiving enhanced case management services. So all of us collaborating together, we were able to find out who his case manager was in the healthcare field, touch bases with them so we can have a more productive outcome for him.
Thank you. Going to question number 2 is how can you support Mr. Williams in reaching his housing goal? So the first thing to look at is, will Mr. Williams' criminal background affect his eligibility for subsidized housing? Based on the criminal record that he had, it could. But the biggest obstacle that he faced really was his income and his disability. Because he was limited in income. So a lot of times the record can affect someone and getting into housing, but there's ways to work around that, as Michelle mentioned earlier. So for us, the biggest part was finding somewhere that he could afford. And then what interim housing options are available while he waits for housing placement through a housing subsidy program. Initially, the first thing to think of is shelter for the individual. If there's any availability when they are immediately released, if there's some shelter beds, transitional and shared housing. We did mention that he was tased, so definitely looking into those programs. And kind of like what Tricia said earlier, you want to look at the other avenues of that individual. So we hit on that he has AOD, mental health. So what I always try to do, if the reentry aspect cannot cover that individual around housing, I start tapping into those other things. Does he qualify for AOD services? Maybe there's some support there to get him some housing. Or from the mental health aspect, because he did have an enhanced care manager, was there some housing around there? So there was more options if the reentry part was not as helpful. So I had to tap into all of that. And then what about shared housing? This could include and then shared housing. shared room, and individual, yes, will be available for him. So those were some of the housing support options that immediately, as his case manager, not only did I think of the reentry part, I knew that was really short, and he needs long term. So I know with reentry, it could be about 6 to 12 months, but it's usually individuals have to have some kind of income with a step down. And this individual was SSI, so realistically, it was looking and tapping into his other needs to be able to support him. How can we talk to Mr. Williams about his housing situation? From the beginning, it's being honest. Really understanding what barriers this individual faced and be honest about what's available. Usually, with working with individuals, my first thing is if they're walking out and they do not have somewhere to go, my first thing is to try to get them into a shelter because there is a process for people to get into any type of housing program. There's an intake, there's a referral process. A lot of times, it is not immediate. Laos is one of the only reentry programs as of right now that actually come into the jails and enroll people while they're in custody and house them when they get out. But there's certain qualifications for that. So until that gets a little bit better, usually someone may walk out without housing. So talk about being honest and just what's available to them. Um, I'll let Walanda talk about the budget review because she does that aspect of it. So I'll let her discuss the next bullet.
Thank you, Nicole. So yeah, conducting a budget and review, sometimes that is not first and foremost, especially in this case study that we're dealing with this gentleman. Um, First and foremost, of course, once he got housed, we can definitely go into that and determine how much he needs for his rents and bills, but also discuss the housing options. Because in this situation, this person was not ready to discuss the income and the budgeting yet. And sometimes we have to take that a little ways down. So discussing his housing options for him after providing some services with us, such as transitional or shelter living, that would come little later, but he had to be open about that. And sometimes in this case study, Mr. Williams wasn't always open to that right off the bat. To support him with financial management and discussing shared housing. Once we did that, because I have seen, and I probably speak for Nicole too, once you get housed, then you could think a little bit more clearly, because you're not having to worry about where am I going to sleep tonight. Supporting with financial management and discussing shared housing. Discuss supportive housing and subsidized housing options due to his age, disability, or income was all factor in Mr. Williams' case study here that we're studying. So in this case, also, again, once you get housed, you feel a little bit more at ease. We could talk about that budgeting because it has to have a conversation. We could talk about how this person would interact with certain people that he was in the shelter with or in transitional housing with, because that also plays a factor when we're dealing with AOD and the substance abuse part. That's all, Nicole.
Okay, and then going to the last question, I do see the questions and the comments. I will uh, It was a very important question and comment. I will address it after the last question. Is the client already connected with support partners, and what type of additional support does he need? So I will speak from my current role that I'm in right now. So a lot of folks don't know that there is a lot of pre-release work that is done for those that are incarcerated within Contra Costa County. And while they're incarcerated here, either in Marsh Creek, West County, or Martinez, they can actually do a lot of the work in here. The sad part about it is it's not forced. It's not required. It's if they want to, and we try to encourage them to. And the reason why I'm saying that is because normally when we ask that question, where they connected to, they can connect to a slew of providers while they're in custody. So there are three main providers that are, four now, providers that are approved to do the pre-release. So they can work with Health Right 360, which covers East County. They are the service network. So they do all the service navigation for individuals. We have Rubicon and the Reentry Success Center. Rubicon is in both in Antioch, Concord, and in Richmond area that does the employment. And they're tied onto like legal aid and a slew of other different services. We have Men and Women of Purpose. And then we now have Laos that come in, and we're, connecting to a few of other providers that are coming in as well. So they do have and they also meet with employers inside. Beer Legal Aid comes inside. So a lot of the partners, they are already touching partners while they're incarcerated. For those that may have already been released, how do you find out if they're connected to partners? Well, one is always by self-reporting. But if you're not a current provider that works in this field, I highly recommend for individuals that's touching this population, go meet those providers. Find out who those reentry providers are. They're definitely wanting to connect with you all because we all touch the same person, so that when you do have someone that comes across your plate that has a background, you know exactly who connect to and to collaborate with. So this particular individual was connected to everybody, and I mean, he was connected to everybody. What type of additional support does he need? As mentioned before, so let me just go down a list. So reentry partners, depending on where he's located, there's West, East, and Central. This individual was returning to Central, so they were connected to partners out in Central County, which was the Rubicon program, and Health Right 360, and allows for the housing. Um, um, there's other programs that are available as well, such as GEO, Hope Solutions, Impact Justice, and Sheltering as well, which has their own set of qualifications on who can qualify for that. But he was referred to the programs that I meant. Some other additional support needs that he needed was, as we mentioned before, transportation, going back and forth from his appointment, and he had SSI, so public benefits. So we tapped into the shelter was amazing. They helped us with when he originally got out. The core team, we tapped into the reentry health conductors to provide some support around there. And they were great in trying to help us try to figure out who his care team was to get him back and forth to his appointments. And let's see what type of additional support. And then the other part that came in kind of last was on top of his individual, like his disability. I want to focus on he was dealing with mental and substance abuse. And that information didn't come out until later. So you have to kind of figure out, what am I going to focus on first? So this one kind of went backwards. Everybody was so focused on the housing, which is extremely important, and getting him back and forth to deal with his tumors. And then we had to pivot and focus on the substance abuse because there's medicine that comes with that. So this was really a complex situation. So then AOD had to be bring in to focus on his recovery aspect of it. And then after that was focused on, then it kind of pivoted over to his mental health. So there was a lot of moving parts with this particular case study, this individual, on how the support was being able to be provided to him. Well, did I miss anything for the last one?
No, I don't think you missed any. Oh, excuse me. Actually, you did. Did you mention the core team
Oh,
to
the
show the
yeah,
core team?
yeah, the reentry the reentry court team also, yes, provided support even before and after. So, support from jail to the shelter. They provided support in getting us connected to all parties. What I do want to say is I want to give an example of a collaboration. And the reason why we use this one is because this was a very great collaboration. And when it comes to how all the county partners can work. So, with this support, a big case conference should be or can be or recommended to be conducted, which involves everybody, including from reentry to AOD to mental health, of course, with all the ROIs and everything signed. That is actually the best way to provide support for this individual because there were too many moving parts, and if everybody's not on the same page on how to support him, it can easily cause issues with this particular client. So CORE played a very good part in here, as well as the reentry team and the shelter. And because of all the support that he received, as I mentioned before, this particular individual, he had cases in other counties. He was able to prevent being incarcerated in other places due to all the support that Contra Costa County provided. So it was a great outcome for this individual.
I like to add in too, Nicole, that the transportation portion was key. Mr. Williams was receiving um so much help from different partners, and we able to manage that through getting assistance for Uber rides, and that came from being placed on his because of his healthcare situation that he had going on with the brain tumors. And so that healthcare team was able to provide him at least getting back and forth to work. I mean, excuse me, back and forth to different agencies for different things. Also, I forgot we didn't mention Bay Area Legal Aid got involved at some point as well, because we were wondering, is this person able to work? Is he not? Some people were saying he could work. He couldn't work because of his tumors, because of the prescription medication he was taking. It wasn't feasible for him. So Bay Area Legal Aid got involved as well. So we could have some kind of documentation saying this person is not able to work at this time, and that came into play as well.
And
I
that
think
actually, yep, that actually helped with his housing. So from a reentry perspective, and Walana can speak on that, a lot of the housing providers, one of the things that we need is, the funding is limited. So they need some type of income to get them into permanent housing. So by him being able to get that document, he was able to be provided with, 6 months or so housing support, and then to find him a home they can actually go into and afford, based on the income that he received from SSI. And the work is still being continued to get him eventually into more permanent supportive housing. I did want to address a question that it asks, is a client. Is that okay if I address that, Michelle? Okay. I was watching the
Yes.
chat as I
Yeah,
typed.
thank you, Nicole. That's great.
Is the client eligible for reentry services if he is released without a probation officer? So this is one of the parts that, as Michelle mentioned, I am part of a chair within cabinet, something that we're working on. So unfortunately, and I mentioned that earlier, when someone is released and they are not on any type of probation because they have completed their timeout, they do not qualify for some of the programs that are available. There are programs out there that do provide housing to individuals that have served time in state prison. Um, Such as like, I know that Sheltering is one, and I believe, don't quote me wrong, Hope Solution staff if I say it wrong, but I believe Hope Solution does as well. But if one of the hardest things that we have, if someone leaves jail right now, they don't have probation, they do not qualify for a program such as LAOS. So right now, it's getting them tapped into the other program. So it's digging deeper into what other issues they may have, finding out, like I think it was a question posed before within the presentation of looking at other barriers that they have to kind of figure out what else they may qualify for within the county. So usually what's immediately available is the shelter, or sometimes they walk out and they have employment. I have some shared housing, transitional housing, that is available, and sometimes individuals, they can walk right out and they can pay for it themselves. But in reference to getting referred to a housing provider, it's a little bit more difficult because they don't have probation. And that's it. That's all we have.
Thank you so much, Nicole and Walanda. I so appreciate that. That was great. Want to open it up and see if anyone has any questions for them about this particular case, or in general based on what they presented. And again, you can raise your hand or put your questions in the chat. I'm going to, if you all think of questions, you're welcome to raise your hand or put it in the chat. I'm just going to go over this very briefly, like the high level summary of strategies. And this is going to, as you can see, lots of words on the side. This is going to just be emailed out to you, but wanted to just draw your attention to what we're talking about here. Is okay. Again, like high level, the things you're going to want to be doing is reviewing the criminal record with your clients, with the participants. And as Nicole and Walanda said, really working with them, partnering with them to identify more information about their records, and also what kind of support services that they're already connected with and what their community supports are. And then we also have information here about requesting copies of the criminal records, and then also qualifying for a fee waiver. So that will also be going out with the slides. You can also refer participants to legal services to have their records cleared or expunged. And so there's the Clean Slate program. There's a self-help guide through the California state courts. And then we have some additional resources here that we will also send out. And then developing a plan to address barriers. So again, these are the types of things that Yolanda and Nicole just went into in great detail, but this gives some additional information as well. And then we're also going to be sending out information about FEHA, the California Fair Employment and Housing Act, as well as information about working with people that are on the 290 sex offense registry. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Sarah to wrap this up.
Thanks so much, Michelle. Yeah, at the end, we have a few resources listed. The first is the No Bars to Home report. This is a report that highlights the essential elements and key takeaways of successful housing programs that are supporting folks that are impacted by the criminal legal system, and also supporting folks who were formerly incarcerated. So it has a lot of really good information in there that we hope you guys get to take a look at. And then we have tools and resources linked here. This will take you to the CLSI website, and there's a lot of toolkits here on a variety of topics. Examples of which include like landlord engagement, more resources on fair housing and FEHA, housing considerations for survivors of domestic violence, and so much more. So just a few that kind of came to mind right now, but yeah, please take a look there, and we're happy to kind of connect with you if you're looking for something in particular. Then we have the Grants Pass versus Johnson overview and action steps. This just really gets into what the post Grants Pass landscape can look like and what different action steps can look like, and what they can accomplish in the current climate. And then we have the California Civil Rights Department's Fair Housing and Criminal History fact sheet. This is kind of a good resource for Fair Housing 101. And it helps you get a sense of landlord rights, tenant rights, and a whole lot more. And then finally, we have the CLSI newsletter linked in there, and that is just a good way to kind of keep connected with us. It goes out on is it monthly, Michelle, or quarterly? The
That
newsletter.
goes out quarterly.
Quarterly, yeah. It goes out quarterly. It's usually chock full of a lot of good information about any kind of initiatives we're launching, anything that we're working on. It's a good way to stay connected with us. So hope you all get a chance to subscribe to that. But yeah, those are some of the resources we have here. And before you log off, I believe there is a feedback survey that has been linked into the chat. These surveys just really help us get a good sense of what went well, what we can do better next time. So I'm hoping that y'all can take a few minutes to get that filled out. Thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed the content and the presentation, and we really appreciated having you all in the room and hearing from you and your engagement. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you, everybody. I wanted to just remind folks this is recorded, and we will have the entire slide deck, including the case study, as well as the recording. We're going to post it on our website, and we're also going to email you all directly. But it would really help us if before you pop off this training, you take a minute to fill out that quick survey that just helps us make sure we're providing the right kinds of training and the right level of content for everybody. You're also welcome to hang out here for a little bit if you have questions. Otherwise, I think you're liberated and free to go. You have a half an hour of your life back, but we can hang out here for a little bit in case there are remaining questions. And thank you to all of our trainers for fantastic training, especially Yolanda and Nicole. You guys did great.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Have a good day.
Yes, thank you so much, Yolanda and Nicole. So appreciate it.
We're just going to hang out here awkwardly for a little while in case anybody has questions, but you're not mandated to sit here.
I have a question. I don't know if you might have already covered it, but working with a particular client who we are applying to like a lot of affordable housing, hoping at some point they get called. So that's just like a mini kind of like tell me your income, your address. But then once they get their application, at some point, it can take years. And I'm more concerned about the husband who is actually currently incarcerated, and she wants him to be, once he gets out, come back and live with them if they're able to find housing because they're currently homeless. Are we saying that we can call the reentry to help the husband if that would be a barrier? I just don't know, like we applied for the affordable housing and then we're hoping they get called, and then if there is that, I'm not sure what to do at that point.
So, and will this person be on probation or parole? Do you know?
Most likely they're gonna be having a probation officer.
Okay. Yeah. So you're wondering how to approach it in those first when that person is coming out, and your client though is the person's spouse.
Yes, it's gonna be the head. I mean, we don't know when they're gonna get called because those she can't afford is just affordable housing. Those so this can be a month, it could be 2 years from today, who knows? But I think if there is gonna be a barrier, it's gonna be the husband.
Yeah. Yeah, so in that case, I would definitely encourage you to reach out to the person's probation officer and see what kind of services they're going to be getting, and see if you can coordinate directly with them based on the housing options that you're trying to connect for the spouse, and kind of treating it the same way in terms of identifying if there's mitigating information. So if there are parts of the record that could potentially be creating barriers to housing or potentially not. And if there are, then seeing what other kind of mitigating information you can get for the husband, based on information on what happened while they were in custody, before custody, what their plans are when they come out.
Okay. And then for those clients who are homeless and have a long history of like maybe having not necessarily what do we call that? Selling drugs in the past, possibly a felony. But they're not currently linked to probation. It's just something that is in their record. Is there an agency that can help them with that if they're applying for housing and they have this in their record?
Yeah, so we sent out in the case study that I just linked, it includes some suggestions for specific organizations to contact. And then we're going to also be putting it into, I think we also put it into the chat and we can send it out after. But one of the things you would do is potentially looking at record expungement. So if they have a criminal record, but that is something where in some cases you can get that expunged, so it's not going to show up on their record anymore. Or you can also partner with legal providers and also with additional direct support services, such as the ones that Nicole and Yolanda talked about, in order to have it where even though they don't have access to probation or parole officer, that they're getting connected with services.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
Any other questions?
Hi, I had put my question in the chat.
Oh,
So, I have a client who's unhoused. He has 2 dogs, pit bull dogs. There was a point where there was space in the shelter for him with just one. He is not going to give up. He's not going to leave his dogs. And I am connected with CORE, and they had came out. They had set up an appointment with him to go out to take him to DMV. It's much needed because we're trying to get him on public assistance and get his SSI going. But when they came, he had no one to watch his dogs. I don't know of any housing to think of or shelters, that I could maybe sign him up for with his dogs. I was just wondering if you knew of any resources.
I am not aware of anything offhand. I don't know if anyone else on the call is, or Jamie, if you have any specific suggestions. I know that is a really tricky one, especially when there's multiple dogs and with certain dog breeds as well. It could be tricky.
Yeah, I don't have any answers off the top of my head. Yeah, if CORE doesn't know, I definitely don't know.
Yeah. Any other questions? Okay, great. Well, thank you everyone so much. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, everybody. I'm going to close us out.
Great,
Thanks so much.
Jamie.
Brandy, I see your question. No, there won't be a certificate with this training. Good question. But if you need confirmation, I'm happy to shoot an email if you need it. Thanks, everybody.